Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and warm welcome to our Logical Talk 15. Hi, Anurag. Good afternoon.
Hi, Jyant. How are you?
Very good. Hi, Brian. Good evening for you.
Good evening, Giant. Yes, Anurag.
Hi, Brian.
So, thank you, Anurag and Brian, for being in this discussion today. Uh, as I'm seeing in the very last couple of minutes, people have been joining in. I'm sure we will have the full house in a couple of more minutes. So we would use that time to just do a very customary, introduction about Lawbit, and I would request Brian and Rag to also give a quick introduction about Anthesis and the By the Books as well, as we jump onto the discussions from here on. Quickly for everyone about Lawbit, I'm sure by now most of you are already aware about it, and if you already we must be using our services. Lawbit offer SaaS-based risk and regulatory compliance obligation management software for enterprises, and our software is integrated with the global regulatory intelligence and the regulatory change management for over 70 countries. Today, we are serving around 300 plus entities globally, and with 1,500 plus locations mapped. So we have clients in 35 plus industries, from a shipping to steel manufacturers to a GCC. We have clients in different industries. We have maintained a very enviable 100% client retention over since the time the company was formed. And we have a passionate team of around 80 plus legal and tech professionals. And beyond the regulatory risk compliance management solution, we offer you legal matter management, which is your litigation and notice management, enterprise risk management, as well as we offer services like compliance health checks or managed legal services and business impact assessments for our clients in India and globally. Today, for this discussion, I've been joined by Brian and Anurag. Brian, first of all, thank you so much for accepting our request to come on to the discussion today. And before I introduce Brian, I just also want to tell you we've been actually working on this webinar for more than 1.5 months now. We have multiple round of discussion as to what really works. And what do actually the Indian businesses needs to know about the modern slavery regulations, because this is becoming a very important aspect. And as I always talk about this, as the geopolitics scenarios is changing, I think this has a very important regulation, and which if you have to do business globally, we need to be well aware of it and ensure that we are on the right side of these regulations as well. So Brian is a senior corporate strategy advisor with Anthesis Group, based out of Australia. And Brian, it's 8 p.m. for you, if I'm understanding the difference well. Brian is an experienced ESG and corporate strategy advisor, and whatever I have interacted with Brian, I found him very empathetic. He has when I've written here, the social factor included in the ESG, the S factor is what he focuses on. I think this is something which comes from the heart for him. So he's very passionate and empathetic about this subject, and he is also a two-time Fulbright scholar. He speaks Indonesian, and he is also attained a master degree from Georgian Washington University. So Brian has seen the extreme corners of the world. He's lived in the US and Australia, worked in those territories, worked extensively on the UK laws as well. I'm sure we have a lot to learn from Brian. Brian, maybe if you could also do a quick introduction about Anthesis, so that we all understand about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Giant, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. Anthesis is the entity floating behind me here on my background. we're a sustainability consulting firm that spans the world. We've got offices in about 25 different countries and are delivering projects in over 80 different countries. There's about 1,400 of us now, all dedicated to sustainability. So carbon emissions reduction, ESG strategy, and of course, human rights and social impact, which is where I sit in the supply chain and operations team, focused on transparency and ethics and human rights in supply chains. That's a little bit about us, Jyant. I might hold it at that. I don't want to talk too long about Anthesis because we do have a lot of good ground to cover, and I want to save some room for Anurag as well.
Thank you, Brian. Anurag, I'm sure is a known face for all of us. Anurag is again, I always introduce as a very good friend, Anurag, and he's a co-founder and partner in ByTheBooks Consulting. Anurag comes with more than 15 plus years experience into the consulting field. He has worked with the big fours, and at one point of time he decided that there are a lot of specific services which corporates are require, and he decided to start and co-founded ByTheBooks. And today they are providing a lot of specialized services. And Anurag, I would rather leave this down to you to have give us a quick introduction about ByTheBook as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Jyant, and thanks for organizing this webinar on such a niche area, particularly for Indian companies. And thanks, Brian, for being a part of this session. So, ByTheBook, as Jyant you explained, is into providing tax and regulatory compliance and advisory services. So there's a lot of advisory and compliance areas that we cover, be it from the taxation, social security, and immigration point as well. We also had the opportunity to collaborate with Brian and his team on a specific modern slavery project, and that is how the introduction came. And basically, we collaborated on that project. We provided a very good value addition to an Indian listed company. So that was all from my side. I am just thankful that we are basically covering this topic. I know many of the participants would be interested in knowing, and in fact, I received a call from one of my Indian clients who just wanted to understand what exactly the modern slavery is all about. So I told him, either you attend the session, or whenever in case he is not free because of some exigencies, he should surely see the video, and then he would be able to understand what the topic is all about, what is the impact it would be having on Indian companies who are rapidly expanding their geographical presence across the world.
Yes. Thanks, Anurag. So let's get started quickly onto our discussion, and thank you so much. And I think we have a lot of participants by now already. So in this discussion, and let me just quickly, while the agenda is right in front of you, I just summarize what we are going to cover. We will try and understand what actually is modern slavery and how, what exactly it means, because it's a very vague term nowadays. Sometimes we feel, we actually do not. Slavery is the past. We don't even have slavery today. What exactly it is? What are some of the global survey shows, and how rampant it is right now? And slavery specifically from the point of view of in Asia and the Pacific, slavery from the global perspective as to which countries still have it's a rampant practice, and where do India stand also. Some of this expectation from the regulators, what they want you to, how do you want to comply with, how it impacts the Indian businesses who are trying to do business abroad. We also will talk about some of those examples, which kind of industry it impacts, because there are a lot of myths around it. If I'm doing a certain business, will it really impact me or not? And ways and means how to you comply with it. How you contribute to the solution overall. And we will also be happy to take some of the queries towards the end of the discussion. So like always, please feel free to write to us on the chat box, we will try and pick your your queries from there as well. So Brian, over to you now.
Thank you, Jyant. As the agenda indicated, we're going to spend a little bit of time today just becoming familiar with what this issue is, because many of you on the call will be very familiar with this, and you'll know exactly what we're talking about when we say modern slavery and combating modern slavery. It'll be familiar language to you. But others on the call, this might be the first time that you're hearing about this particular issue, both from a systemic global problem as well as a regulatory obligation in some parts of the world. So we're definitely going to spend a little bit of time on explaining what it is. Because Jyant, I think you're exactly right. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with different clients in different parts of the world, and inevitably I will hear almost every time somebody say, "Yes, but that's not an issue in this country." No matter what country it is, I've had clients in America and New Zealand, all over the place, and they'll say, "But this is not an issue here." But it's not true. It's an issue everywhere in every single country. So let's dig into it. Modern slavery, it can be defined quite accurately as the exploitation of people using coercion and abusive practices. And this is the key here. It's when people are deprived of their freedom and they cannot safely refuse to leave a situation. So they might be in regard to forced labor, they might be in a working environment that they cannot safely leave. There could be, repercussions if they leave. There could be threats of violence if they leave. Potentially their passport could be withheld, and so they actually have no legal ability to leave a working condition. This is a very common form of modern slavery. So let's look at the numbers. There's a shocking 50 million humans in the world estimated to be trapped in slavery. Now that's more people in slavery than during the peak of the American slave trade, for example. That's more slaves in the world today than any other time in human history. So the problem is in fact getting worse, not getting better. And when you break it down, you've got 28 million people are in forced labor. So that's kind of the example I mentioned before, where they're in a working condition and they can't leave, and there's coercion and abusive practices associated with that working condition. Then there are 22 million people in forced marriage, where they were too young or they had no choice but they were forced into it, and they cannot, again, safely leave, coercion and abusive practices. There's also 12 million children trapped in slavery. Now, the math whizzes in the room will add that up, and it's obviously not 50. And that's because there are quite a few children, both in forced marriage as well as in forced labor, which is really, really disheartening. Now, let me tell you a few things about what slavery is not. Children working does not necessitate modern slavery. It doesn't mean if you see a kid, working behind a counter at a small shop, a family shop, that doesn't mean it's modern slavery. Again, it has to be abusive practices, coercion, and the worst forms of child labor. So where those children are absolutely unsafe physically or mentally. Same with forced labor. Not getting paid a fair wage or even a legal wage. India has very extensive minimum wage laws based on skill thresholds for every state. not getting paid your due wage by law does not mean that you're in modern slavery. It might mean that you're in an illegal working environment, but it doesn't necessitate you being in modern slavery. However, it is a strong indication of vulnerability, and vulnerability is ultimately what traps people in slavery. Okay, I really value this visual because I've thrown a lot of millions at you. It's very hard to conceptualize those numbers. I'm a visual person. So seeing this, if you just randomly selected 150 humans from anywhere on Earth, one of them, statistically, one of them out of 150 would be a slave. That is an absolutely shocking number to me, and it is devastating. It is not acceptable that in 2024, this is the reality that we're looking at here. So that means one of those people is in a coercive, abusive working environment that's unsafe, and they can't leave it. That's a problem. That is a huge problem. As I said at the start, this is not a problem that's isolated to any one country. Every single country on Earth has something to answer for in terms of forced labor, in terms of child labor, and forced marriages. So you can see this map. It's from the Global Slavery Index, which is sort of the preeminent indice globally for estimating modern slavery prevalence around the world. The darker the color is, the more prevalent modern slavery is as a proportion to population size. So this is not net. This is not total numbers. This is the proportion to the population. So you can see India there is a bit pink. So it doesn't have the highest prevalence, but because the population is so high, there's a lot of humans trapped in slavery in India. China as well is darker still, but the U.S. as well. Look at the color of the U.S. Still, quite a high prevalence. So you look all over the world, and this is a really serious issue that needs resolution. I don't know why Greenland is the only gray country. Perhaps they didn't survey there. Or maybe there's just not enough people there. I'm not sure. Right. Next slide, please, Trisha.
Bren,
Oh, yeah.
if I stop you on the previous slide,
please go back. Yeah, go back.
The way I'm seeing the world scenario right now with so many wars happening, any war increases the slavery, right?
Totally.
And the geopolitical scenario is as I see is such wherein possibly the slavery percentage will increase, and even in the developed nations also, what I'm seeing when the people are moving in, and maybe they're as a migrant, or they're taking refuge there, but inadvertently they are being pushed to slavery.
Yes.
Isn't that something which is an alarming thing, or maybe something which we all need to also be cautious? Because if such things happen, if not today, maybe in 2 years, governments and regulators may start becoming more and more stringent on these aspects as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jain. I think that's a really astute observation, because you look here on this map already, and it looks as if this is already reflective of increased vulnerability from geopolitical instability, but it's not. This data was released in 2023, but it was collected for 2 years before that. So it's actually based on about 2021 survey data. So before the war in Ukraine and before the war in Israel. And so, but you look at those regions on this map and they're already high prevalence. So you're right. If you do this survey again, which they will probably in a year or two, you're going to see much, much more intense red around Ukraine, across Europe and throughout Russia, and probably the Middle East as well. So you're exactly right, and that's just geopolitical instability from war, acute war. There's also a lot of war happening in Africa as well right now, which is causing instability too, and increased vulnerability. But the other main driver of vulnerability right now is climate change. The internal in-country migration and extra national migration is increasing already, and we're just getting started with regard to climate change and the migration that's happening around the world because of that. So again, that increases human vulnerability, and vulnerability is what enables people to get trapped into these slave-like conditions.
And sorry, I'll take one more minute on this subject. In fact, in close to India, we are also seeing a lot of political unrest in Myanmar. And if we clearly, look at it, whenever any political instability or war happens, it does not increase slavery in that country, but it increases slavery in the neighboring countries.
The periphery. You're exactly right. Because yeah.
And as from Myanmar, we are also seeing that a lot of people are migrating on, and they are not counted for at all, and they are being used as slave. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not saying here how many Indian companies are using it, and I don't have any statistic on this, but inadvertently they would move to a country which is peaceful, which is doing good, and they would it increase slavery there. So we can't at any point of time say, okay, I'm in a developed nation, we are civilized and no slavery. Any developed or civilized nation will attract more slaves than a war-torn nation.
Yeah, because there's refugees that are by their very nature have very high vulnerability. They don't have access to social safety nets. They may not speak the language. They may not have networks to fall back upon. So you're exactly right. And the legal system may not be protecting them adequately. That's all good points, Jyant. All good points. Trisha, I might have you bump to the next slide here, which I really, I think this really gets to what we were just talking about there, which is the extent of modern slavery across Asia and the Pacific. So of those 50 million humans that are trapped in slavery today, 29.3 million of them are estimated to be in Asia and the Pacific, which is where you and I and most of us on the call are sitting in that part of the world today. So 6.8 slaves per 1,000 for that region, and that's almost 60% of the global estimate. Vulnerability, as we know, is a key driver for slavery, including in India, as well as conflict, natural disasters, poverty. These things reduce people's access to those protections that they need to stay away from entrapment. But again, very important to say that nowhere in Asia is without slavery, including Australia, where we went from an estimated 15,000 people in slavery, which is 15,000 people too many, to the most recent estimates being 41,000 people in slavery. So we are going in the wrong direction. We are over doubling our estimated amount of people in slavery over a 5-year period. So it's a huge problem here for us as well. India, just by the sheer magnitude, India is the largest country in the world now, with 1.4 billion people, and some 11 million, 50,000 of those people are estimated to be trapped in slavery. So that's a relatively low prevalence considering other countries around India, so 8 out of 1,000. But the sheer size, the magnitude of India makes it a very serious problem for a country like India. So this is looking at more, how does this issue connect to companies. So we've got a lot of multinational companies on the call right now, medium to large multinational companies. And really, this issue of modern slavery becomes real for a company in 3 different ways. One is your internal operations. So every company has, ranging size of internal operations. They hire people, they generate economic activity, they subcontract, whatever it may be. You're busy doing things. In those internal operations, there can be modern slavery within an entity's own house, within its own operations. It's pretty unlikely. It's a lot less likely, but it does happen. It happens to us here in Australia. It happens everywhere. For example, a common one that happens to those of us in offices, fancy offices and high-rise buildings in giant metropolitan cities, is after we pack up and go home at 5 or 7 or whatever, a wave of subcontracted workers that may be contracted out 2 or 3 times to different labor hire organizations or cleaning companies might come through our offices and clean those offices. And we don't really talk to them. And we don't typically know their names or who they work for or what country they came from. Oftentimes they could be migrant workers that have higher vulnerability. There's been a lot of instances in Australia where slavery has been found in those types of cleaning contractors. That's just one example of very, very many of how companies can be directly exposed to slavery, but not even know that it's right there. The second one is the purchases. So the stuff that we buy. This is a really tricky one. But companies buy so much stuff, and it's not just our main product or our main economic activity that generates us our profit. It's also all the ancillary stuff that we buy, like this laptop that I'm talking to you on now, and the rare earth metals and the componentry that go into this laptop. They span all the way back to the DRC in Africa. They span all over the world. And how do I know that those different products and materials inside of this laptop are clean and are made without the use of slavery? It's a challenge. This is another way that companies are directly or indirectly linked to slavery. And that last point there, the indirect purchases. So there's the entities that you buy the laptop from, the entity you pay, but that laptop stretches down the value chain so far that you end up having hundreds and hundreds of people associated with the value chain of that laptop. India imports a lot of stuff. You have a huge economy, a very large global economy, and an estimated $24 billion USD of those imports are at high risk to having been produced with modern slavery somewhere else in the world. So we're not just talking about the estimated 11 million slaves that are working in India. We're also talking about imported inbound products that might have been produced in another country with slavery. So for India, much like a lot of places in the world, the electronics is a big concern. Textiles is a big concern. Palm oil is a big concern. Gold and minerals, as well as solar panels. Solar panels have a high potential for forced labor in them. So these are some of the products that are most concerning when brought into India.
Yeah, in fact, this is a very, very key slide because, Brian, in all my conversation with the Indian companies, the perception is, are we required to just ensure that counter slavery policies are in place and it covers the operations of the organizations only? But this is where this slide becomes important and pertinent, is that it is not only your operations which encompasses this issue, but rather the direct as well as indirect purchases as well. And that is why when we are having those conversations with Indian companies, we're telling them, look, not only look at your operations, but rather what you are doing in terms of your suppliers. Suppliers could be your direct purchases. So when I purchase any tech product, it might be getting sourced through Africa, it might be getting sourced primarily from China now.
Mm.
So just to ensure that how my supply chain management is being managed is an important area.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Anurag. And there's three so far, three legislations around the world that hold companies responsible for the direct and indirect purchases in their supply chain. And this is a huge shift. So I think this is probably a good time to go to the next slide, which really covers the regulatory obligations around the world that respond to this issue. So now you know what modern slavery is. You know how it might be interacting with your business, either directly or indirectly. This is the government response. So governments around the world are seeing this issue and preparing various types of legislations that compel organizations to respond to this issue in some way. About three of these, the two that I've listed in Europe and the one in Canada, include very strict and very strong legislations around that supply chain element. So they make you responsible as a company for not just what happens under your roof, but also all of your subcontractors and their people, as well as the entities that you buy from and the full value chain, all the way down to the raw materials that go into your mobile phone or your electronics that you use in a working condition. So this is a very big shift. The Australian Modern Slavery Act down there at the bottom, it mentions your supply chain obligation, and it says that you need to assess your risk in your supply chain all the way to source, but it doesn't really define how to do that, how to assess your risk, and it doesn't penalize companies financially if they don't. So it's kind of an ambiguous obligation in our act, whereas the European Act, the new one that was just passed a few months ago, the CSDDD, it has huge liabilities for companies that fail to identify a risk, and if they do identify a risk, that fail to do something about it. This is a big regulatory shift. So for those of you on the call that have operations and or even business interests in Europe, this is going to be a big change as this CSDDD is phased in across the European Union, and a lot of you would have companies that are already operating in Europe right now.
Brian, just one question, more of a curiosity here. There are a lot of European nations which already have, modern anti-slavery regulations before the CSDDD. What happens to them? Will this new regulation override them? And is it more stringent than what these countries were already having as the anti-slavery regulations? And third thing is, when do these CSDDD come in force?
Yeah, CSDDD is going to be phased in starting next year, with largest entities going first. So if you're a Toto, if you're really big, then you're going to trigger the first wave. But if you're a medium enterprise or you're looking to break into the European market, you're not going to be directly impacted by CSDDD. You'll be indirectly impacted by it. So remember, there's going to be you'll be impacted by it potentially if you're selling to a large European company. So you don't actually just have to be doing business and making money in Europe. You're also going to be impacted by this if large European companies want to buy your products, because they're going to be asking you to prove that those products are safe and made without slavery. And they're going to ask you, where did you get the raw materials that went into that product? Even if it's service. So if you're a tech company in India and you're selling services to Europe, they're going to send you questions, extensive questionnaires that ask you for your policy suite. Have you conducted a due diligence on your supply chain and your suppliers? And do you have a response to the? They're going to hold you to a very high standard because they're held financially responsible by the CSDDD.
And in fact, Jed, this is where the trigger lies, because as an Indian company, you might think, okay, I don't have any operations in UK, Australia, or Euro region, so I might not be getting impacted. But you might be having your clients and customers based in these locations, who, while at the time of engaging with you, at the time of that entire procurement life cycle, they may be sending those detailed vendor-related questionnaire, in which one of the questions, what we have generally seen, pertains to this modern slavery aspect, wherein they ask specific questions on whether the organization is complying with the counter slavery legislation, whether they have a strong counter slavery policy, and other sort of information. So it's a very, very detailed and extensive question, and that's where Indian companies tend to struggle, because first and foremost, they are not aware what this legislation is all about. Secondly, what kind of a compliance structure they need to put in place in order to demonstrate their ultimate client that yes, we have a robust system around this entire issue.
Yeah, it's exactly
And
right.
you know what, I may be jumping the gun because I believe you are anyway going to cover this. But if I look at the top exporting industries from India, you would find pharma, you will find food, you will find textile, ITS is one of the major ones in India. Gems in jewelry is another big one. Engineering goods, so now electronics is becoming another big industry from India. We are expanding early. Now, my one question is, ITS GCC is expected to become 1% of the Indian GDP in by 2030. Does it even better matter to them if I'm just providing IT services?
Yeah,
Does it?
it can, and it can matter to an IT service provider in a few ways. One is if that service provider is using subcontracting to provide services, and they may they may sort of lose a little bit of control over the engagement terms with their employees, and they may not necessarily have good visibility over all of their direct and indirect workers, depending on how big they are. So they may not know necessarily that there could be labor abuses happening even within some of the service providers that they use. But it's probably less likely. It's less likely than if you're in minerals, for example. However, the other way that you could be very impacted by that is a client of yours from Europe calls you up and says, hey, we want to see your supply chain risk assessment to see where you've got all of the tech hardware that you're using to service us. Where does that come from? And what degree of confidence do you have that that technology hardware is coming from a reputable source? So they're going to want to see the supply chain traceability back into Malaysia and back into China, and then beyond there, where did the raw materials come from before they were assembled there? So it'll be easier for you to respond to this, but it's not going to be, you don't have an option to not respond unless you want to potentially lose that business.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah, but one quick thing to add, because in the last para we have added that India's government response is above average. So for our audience, I would Just like to add that though India has not yet come out with a counter slavery legislation, but there are a host of measures which the government has taken. First and foremost is the ask for the informal workers to get themselves registered. There is a central portal which the Indian government has created, wherein all the informal workers are required to get registered, which will entail allow the Indian government to roll out the social security scheme for these informal category of employee workers as well, like your platform workers or gig workers. So that is what the new labor code legislation intends to cover. The second important aspect is basically a requirement for top 1,000 listed companies to do a reporting. It's called business responsibility sustainability reporting, BRSR, which covers areas around the sustainability reporting. But having said that, it doesn't right now cover the specific aspects around the human rights due diligence. So that is one missing piece that is there. But I'm sure that the government in the times to come will be expanding the scope of this BRSR reporting to other companies. At the same time, covering this vertical on the human rights due diligence as well.
Thanks, Anurag. In fact, this was one of the question I was holding for the end. Thanks for answering this. Yeah.
Yeah. So good. Thanks, Anurag. I'll be fairly quick on this one. We've talked a bit about this already, which is why I'll be quick. So, some of the main highline implications for Indian multinational companies include risks around reputation. So there's reputational risks for organizations if slavery is credibly linked to you, either in your supply chain or in your operations. There is potential legal action depending on where this issue was identified and your global reach. There are potential financial implications, both from penalties in some of these more strict areas, like in Europe, in Canada, but there's also financial implications from a buyer's perspective, as well as an access to capital and lending perspective. If you're considered very high risk for human rights or modern slavery, or simply have no response at all when asked, you might find it more difficult to gain access to capital in the future from the international market, potentially. And then, of course, there's market access implications. So doing an IPO in, let's say, in London is going to require certain standards be met. Breaking into the European market, you might trigger the CSDDD now. Same with Australia and various places. So you'll trigger these different global legislations based on where you expand globally. A few case studies down there, and then I'll wrap up, and we can open it up to questions. I think so. Two ones that jumped to mind that when Anurag and Jyant and I were discussing this, that we wanted to highlight was just to make this a little bit more real. So South Indian granite quarries have been in the global media quite a lot for high risk of modern slavery. A lot of global reports revealed slavery, and then they linked that slavery in the granite quarries to about 50 large global buyers, and it named each and every one of those buyers. So all these large companies all over the world that have been sourcing granite from India, all of a sudden they're on the front page of the New York Times saying that they've been buying slave-produced granite. So they have immediate financial implications, those 50 companies that the academics and the journalists revealed and linked to slavery. So this for a lot of companies, this would be a nightmare situation. Then even proximity to risk can have implications. So we do a lot of carbon farming due diligence, for example. And if we identify a high risk of human rights risks around, say, a wind farm in Uttar Pradesh, then we might flag that to the client as saying, there's a physical proximity to some risk indicators here, which may have a devaluing factor on a carbon credit sold out of that wind farm. And that's just an example from our own work. There'd be other implications or other examples in other industries, but you can see how this issue, could have those few risk indicators that I've included on the right side of that slide there. So, Anurag, I think I'll leave it at that and see if we might, facilitate some discussion. Oh, I have one more slide. I forgot about this. Shall I talk through this really quickly, or do we want to save the last 15 minutes for questions?
No, I think we should.
Yeah, you can basically cover this slide, Brian, because that is where the participants would be interested in knowing that yes, if we need to basically abide with the counter-slavery legislation which has been implemented in different geographies, what is it that we need to do? Where does it start with? What are the disclosure requirements? I know it differs from legislation to legislation. You and I have worked on the UK and Australia legislation, so we know the difference around it. But just for the benefit of our audience, as to what they need to do as a way forward.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. There, obviously, every one of those legislations that I put up has a different requirement to comply with each of them, with the European one being the hardest to comply with, and some of them being very, very easy, like the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. You just have to put something up on your website and you're done. It's very simple. So, this menu that I've included here is not a compliance process for all legislations. This is just a suggestion about where to begin. These are 6 very common and relatively simple, some of them, steps that organizations should consider when they want to prepare their counter-slavery response or their counter-slavery strategy. So, one, and this is one that Anurag and I have worked on before collaboratively, is voluntary modern slavery statements or disclosures. So an organization could prepare a disclosure to the UK Slavery Act or the Australian Slavery Act or the Canadian Slavery Act to just have a document that lays out how they're taking this issue seriously, what their response is, and they can use that to show to their supply chains and to their potential clients and buyers that they are doing something. They're aware of this issue and responding. A risk assessment. This is such a critical step. So, let's say you have 1,000 suppliers. You need to assess them for human rights or modern slavery risk and identify the 5, 10, 50 that are most risky. And then you can start working on those. You can draw those 50 into human rights due diligence. Human rights due diligence is hard work. You really have to look down the supply chain and down the value chain and interrogate those entities. So do a risk assessment first to narrow your supply chain down to just a few that you can manage, and you deal with those in human rights due diligence. You learn more about them. Policies and contract clauses. You can put in some legal controls and legal protections to make sure that you're reducing your legal risk or your legal exposure, as well as making sure that all of your stakeholders know your stance on this issue. Supplier engagement and collaboration. So, work with your suppliers, particularly your big ones. They're probably doing something on this already. They're probably responding to this issue elsewhere. So they might be very receptive to engaging on this. Collaboration. So if there's a lot of people in the IT sector here, work together and maybe combine your effort so that it's easier for you to respond collectively or as an industry body. And then training, conduct some training to your procurement teams or to everybody. Put it into your e-learning platform so that people know about this issue and they know how to identify it. Set up whistleblowing or grievance mechanisms so that when somebody sees something is wrong, they have a channel to raise this issue to the company so that the company's alerted early to these problems and can try to manage it. All right. There's other things you can do, but these are 6 very common and very well-trodden paths to deepening your modern slavery response.
Yeah, I think the 6th point which you mentioned is pretty important because is the kind of complex supply chain we now have. I take it back to the first example you gave. I don't know if somebody is in my office doing some cleaning job. I don't even know, and maybe my risk manager may never interact with him. But it's just that my admin guy would be interacting with him. He would be able to sense that there's something which is not wrong. So I think training and whistleblowing, I think, could play a very important role again. And considering the scenario wherein we have a complex supply chain right now, and it's only I think it's only going to get more complex as the business expands now. Yeah. Anurag, you were trying to add something?
No, so I was just going through the questions and see what Brian needs to utter. I think there's one question that has come around the arbitration clause part. So one of the question that one of the participants has posed is it mandatory arbitration clause in appointment contracts? Does that lead to modern slavery?
What I don't think I understand that properly. What's an arbitration clause in an appointment contract?
Yeah. So if I'm employed, if I understand this question right, if I give an appointment letter to my employee and I mandatory put an arbitration clause there, does it lead to modern slavery? Let me take this one. I don't think that does lead to a modern slavery, because that's, and correct me if my understanding is that if my correct understanding is wrong. But what I understand from your question.
Yes.
But what I
see. Yeah. I think I understand it now. A mandatory arbitration clause, I guess, rather than being able to go to litigation in court. I think that's what it means, right? Where you have to use arbitration rather than the legal system. No, well, that's probably a violation of human rights. That is not triggering the definition of modern slavery. It's an interesting one. I think that would more likely that'd be a violation of the international human rights expectations, but doesn't by itself constitute modern slavery. No, I don't think so.
And see, there are some of those rights which are given in some of the labor laws in India and in other jurisdictions also, wherein you have other grievances, other regulators where you can go and raise your grievances instead of just by looking at the arbitration clause. I think those options are always open. So it is this contract may itself may be termed void if it is produced in front of the court, but it does. I don't think it leads to the modern slavery.
Yeah, there's a question about delivery boys and Walmart. I think it's a good one. So, putting pressure to perform is not by itself meaning that those workers under pressure are enslaved. Now, if they were, forced to deliver within a certain time, or they would never get access to their passports again, that passes a threshold, which then makes that particular situation coercive. So there's some sort of leverage. If the delivery driver can simply say, stuff this, I don't want to put myself at risk anymore, I'm going to go do some other low-paid work somewhere else, and they walk away without any violence or without any repercussions, then it's technically not slavery. It's just very potentially unethical employment. Same with Walmart. Walmart has some very questionable employment conditions and standards. It's probably not usually directly slavery, but I would guarantee you in Walmart's supply chain, there is a lot of slavery in Walmart's supply chain. If you looked into some of the stuff that they're selling there, their clothing, their textiles for extremely cheap prices, you would have to assume that there's a lot of issues in that supply chain.
That's interesting.
One interesting question that Brian, for you is: can companies claim exemption from such due diligence by stating that they are in a principal-to-principal agreement with the service provider and hence not responsible for identifying the slavery? So this is very pertinent because Indian companies might go back to their ultimate client and say, look, this is a principal-to-principal agreement. How I manage my affairs is my affair. Can they get out of it?
Yeah, they could try that if they're given a direct question by a client or a buyer that asks them for more information. They could try and send that back and say, nah, this doesn't qualify, or this isn't applicable to us. You could try it, but it's probably not going to work, and it might jeopardize your contract with that particular entity, right? They may really want you to respond to that question. Legally, when it comes to legislation around the world, there is no exemption. If you trigger a threshold, then you have to comply. It's a very binary legal question. What is your revenue? Did you make 100 million Australian dollars in one financial year, for our case in Australia? Yes or no? And there's records to prove it, right? In Europe's case, how big are you? How many employees do you have? What's your annual turnover? There's a few different calculations that they use to see if you trigger the threshold, and they have very clear legal definitions. So you'll need to get a lawyer to say, do I trigger CSDDD based on my size and scope in Europe or not? That's going to be a pretty clear legal yes or no.
Yeah. There's another question. It's quite interesting because I'm sure, like in Australia, UK, and other legislation, there's a concept of tax withholding. So the question is around wherever there's a tax withholding being done, can it be treated as a form of a modern slavery? So I know the answer to that, but I would ask Brian to respond to it.
Yeah, I don't think tax withholding, but potentially salary withholding. There could be some situations where withholding someone's salary over and over again indefinitely could start to become coercive, and you basically forcing them to keep working to get the payment from months ago that they're due, and they could be in such a vulnerable situation that they have no alternative but to keep working, hoping that back pay someday will come. So there could be some instances where withholding pay could constitute modern slavery, but withholding tax, I don't think so. I've never thought about that before. Yeah.
No, in fact, there's a related question that in India sometimes happens. There's a lock-in clause. So whenever, let's suppose there's a good amount that is being spent by the company on the training of that particular employee. So normally they would like to insert a lock-in clause that, okay, fine, you complete the training, and to reap the benefits of your training and your expertise, we will impose a lock-in of, let's suppose, 12 months or 15 months in your contract, within which you cannot leave. If you decide to leave, then you will have to pay the training amount or some notice pay, that sort of thing. So that's one of the questions that has been asked by one of the participants, asking whether that is also or could be termed as a modern slavery.
I don't think so, because typically, if somebody's getting a lot of money spent on them for training, they're probably a fairly high skilled worker. And the more skilled they are, the more leverage they have, the more agency they have. They could probably end up getting a job somewhere else, or survive paying the termination fee. I think especially if that person had the ability to choose whether or not they wanted to participate in the training or not at the outset, it's probably not defined as modern slavery. But again, every situation is unique. You have to evaluate each situation in its particular nuances. So you can't just say, oh, this one situation is never slavery and this one always is. It's always more complicated than that. It is always more complicated.
It's a very subjective sort of thing.
That's
to
right.
Assess this. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly.
And one, I think, can we take a last question, Jyant? Do we have the time?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can.
So this is pertaining to UK, and it says, is it mandatory to file the modern slavery statement in the government portal? As according to the Act, it says company has to display the statement in the official website of the company.
Yeah, it has to display on the official website of the company. But last I checked, the UK Act does not necessitate putting it on the registry. In fact, they changed that around. There used to be a government registry that was quite transparent, and then they actually ended that website. So it's not like the Australian Act where there's a centralized registry and you have to submit your statement to the registry. The UK one is more disaggregated. It's good to put it on the registry, though, because then it's easy for your clients, your stakeholders, your buyers to find it and get a sense of confidence that you're doing something about this issue. So, if you do a good statement, I'd put it on the registry.
I think we have covered most of the questions, and I'm sure we would be receiving many questions and queries post this session as well, Brian. But that shows the complexity around this topic. That shows that there is a certain amount of subjectiveness that this entire concept of modern slavery is enshrined in. So yeah, I think from our side, it is a big thank you, Brian, and of course, Jen may like to come up with some concluding remarks.
I think Brian, thank you so much for this session. It was quite engaging and quite knowledgeable for all of us. I just for the concluding remarks, I would also want to for our audience just want to also add. See, as much again, some of it is repetitive, but if you think being sitting in India, we are sitting in a place where is zero slavery. Please think about the changing global geopolitical, economical scenarios. It is all going to impact things, okay, and it is already has started impacting. Look at the look at the textile industry. Bangladesh, be it Sri Lanka, we are facing a lot of competition from those countries. Now, when we are facing a competition, what we want to do is want to lower down your cost, right? Maybe a best of the brand is happy to give your production to Bangladesh or any country which does it at cheap. So you will have to reduce. And what is it? What goes into the cost is people. Diamond, okay, with gems and jewelry is one of the biggest industry which we have from we are the one of the biggest exporter of gems and jewelry. We all know about the scenarios, what kind of people works and how they work. While we have some fancy stories of people getting in cars in the Diwali as a Diwali bonus, but this industry is in a lot of distress right now. So cost cutting will happen. Look at another industry, electronic components. We have a stiff competition. US wants to take the share away from from Taiwan. India wants to take the market away from China. When all this will happen, and there is already on electronic component on manufacturing, there is a discussion happening in Europe where they want to increase the duty. Now, when the duties are increased, when trade wars start happening, the price pressure always everything comes down to the price. When the price wars happen, we tend to have to look at places to get a cheaper work done. Moment we start doing it, we knowingly or unknowingly will step onto the slavery. Okay. And I think that is what we have to be aware of, and which is something what we'll have to, consciously look at, putting the right processes, policies, controls, so that we don't end up being there. And today, again, I'm reiterating, the supply chains are becoming massively complex. We don't manufacturing anything which we own, okay, which we sell also. So in such kind of a scenario, you are heavily dependent on your suppliers. So I think we have to look at this from a very different perspective, and I think some of those data points which Brian shared were quite interesting. And I'm saying they were all available on the somewhere, but we never put an effort to even look at it. Thanks to Brian for sharing this. They were quite eye-opening for all of us. So look at the modern slavery from a different perspective, and as much as I am learning the geopolitical scenario. And I think there's a lot of, you're seeing the markets going up and down. Some industries are going, suddenly becoming a favorite of the share markets because people are expecting Trump to come back to power. All this will impact. Okay. I think let's understand that, and then as per that, put our modern slavery regulations, not just looking at it as, as a one statement we have to put on our website so that it looks beautiful. No, it's not just about that. It's about a lot more, and more, it is starting getting complex. You will, with CSDDD coming in place, you will find more scrutiny happening starting from next year onwards. So it's better we are aware of it right now, and we start putting putting our controls in place. It's much cheaper to put controls today than losing a business in European country.
It's very true.
Yeah. So I think we don't have much of a questions, and we will be putting this recording on our YouTube channel. You have already the links. Please subscribe to it so that you can refer back to them at any point of time. I'm sure you will need it because the kind of data points which Brian shared, I think they were quite fantastic. Brian, thank you so much for your time once again. It's a late evening for you, and still taking out your time after a long day. Pleasure is all ours to have you here today.
Thank you, Jyant. Yeah, and thank you, Anurag, and to all the attendees. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.